John, Michelle, good to see you all.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Just getting the last bits set up on YouTube.
Rabbi, Yerak was asking me if you had uploaded Saturday's message. I don't think you have.
No, I haven't taken sermons from this Shabbat yet.
Oh, okay. I told him that you're more than likely doing it, later, but I hadn't seen one either. Okay, thank you.
Yep, you were absolutely right. I usually do it somewhere in the middle of the following week. So it'll either be today or tomorrow that I'll put it up. All right, give it a second. People to log in through YouTube. Hope everyone is having a nice week. It's not exactly the happiest time of year in the Jewish calendar, but trying to remain a little bit more optimistic this year than we normally do during the days leading up to Tisha B'Av. Just a reminder that there will be a community service tonight. You have to register through the Federation to get access to the Zoom to avoid any Zoom vandalism. If you need a link, let me know, but it was also sent out in the Temple Israel email at the end of last week. And then there will be a community service in the morning tomorrow at 7:45, hosted through the Ohev Shalom website. It won't be a Zoom, it'll be a live stream of the sanctuary. All right, that gave us a little bit of advertising time, and now we can get to studying. So let me go to sharing the screen and turn to the right tab. Okay. I think that is laid out the way I want it laid out. So, good afternoon. Today we are going to be looking at Parashat Vaetchanan, of the next parasha in the book of Devarim. And we're actually going to start off with chapter 4 in Vaetchanan. And Vaetchanan has, like so many parts of the Torah, many, many highlights. But there is something that happens in chapter 4 that seems both novel as well as redundant. And so that is going to get our attention for this today's class. With that in mind, and hearing no objections or seeing no comments of any problems, let's go ahead and get down to work. The best thing we can do is get a little Torah to share. Actually, I think I can make this just a touch bigger. For those who are using a smaller screen, again, if this isn't big enough, then I'm afraid you're just going to have to break out your own copy of the Torah and look for Devarim 4, Deuteronomy 4, chapter 4, but verse 1 as we head on. And now, Israel, give heed to the laws and rules that I am instructing you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord your God, your fathers, is giving you. All right, it's a little bit redundant after all. You know, the chukim and mishpatim, the statutes, the laws, the rules that God has given us. This seems to be, Moses goes on and on about this a lot, as we should expect. I'm saying this tongue in cheek. Obviously, Moses is very concerned that we follow the commandments, and he makes it a focus to repeat this many times. Just as your little Hebrew lesson for the day, notice the third word in this verse, Shema, is of course the same word that it shows up in the famous passage that we recite called Shema, and here it's being translated as give heed. I think probably the best English translation, at least in slightly older English, is hearken, meaning to both hear as well as obey. It's something that is not used as much in contemporary English, but it does capture the double meaning of that sentence. So, you shall not add anything to what I command you, or take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I enjoin upon you. Enjoin here, of course, being the Old English word for commanding. In English, it's uncomfortable to repeat the same root word in multiple forms. So keep the commandments that I command you sounds a little awkward in English. And so the translators will often try to find synonyms in their thesaurus. Personally, I like the repetition because I think it stays closer to the poetry of the original Hebrew. So what is being said here is, of course, that we are not allowed to add or subtract. This is a very complicated topic within Jewish law in general, of when does interpretation become addition or subtraction. But that's not what we are going to focus on, because that Jewish law in general aspect does not seem to be the thrust of this particular chapter. It's important for understanding later on, but not today. You saw with your own eyes what the Lord did in the matter of Baal Peor, that the Lord your God wiped out from among you every person who followed Baal Peor. Right? So this was when there was a flare-up of idolatry within the people during the wilderness, and the people who were worshiping the idols were struck down. While you, who held fast to the Lord your God, who didn't let go of God, who cleaved to God, are all alive today. Right? God is showing that there is a clear difference from that event, that those who rejected God and went for idolatry, they're gone. Those who stayed with God and rejected idolatry, they're still here. See, I have imparted to you laws and rules as the Lord your God, Lord my God has commanded me, for you to abide by in the land that you are about to enter and occupy. Observe them faithfully, for that will be proof of your wisdom and discernment to other peoples, who on hearing of all these laws will say, surely that great nation is a wise and discerning people. So this passage is a very interesting sociological glimpse. We've talked many other times before about motivations for keeping the different commandments in all of their details. Sometimes it is, of course, because it brings benefit to the individual. Sometimes because it brings a spiritual connection. Sometimes because it brings a spiritual repair to yourself or the community. Sometimes it's simply out of fear, which is not the best motivation. But if it works, it's not something that should be avoided. And of course, ideally, it would be because we simply love God. Other times, people will reflect on simply what is effective for their community and what is a good way to live in a more rational and less spiritual way. And this seems to be saying that that is the emotion that other nations are going to have. They will see our communities, they will see us being governed by Torah, and there is something about what they will see that will make them reflect on the wisdom, on the insight of the nation. That something about how the laws are observed or what the laws are when they see them being observed is going to be to our credit. In a sense, this is saying that there is potential bragging rights, that Israel could become famous for being wise if we keep Torah. And if you are worried about your country's prestige in the eyes of the rest of the world, then, this is a way to get prestige. Not through military, not through the economics, but through wisdom as a way to become known. It's a very interesting take, because those of you who are familiar with the rest of the Torah know that in general, we don't care what the rest of the world thinks. Right? In general, we tend to ignore the world's opinion and try and do what we want to do. But here we seem to be almost using popular opinion of the world as an encouragement to the Israelites to keep following Torah. Questions or comments on that so far?
I was going to say, Rabbi,
yes,
it gives rise to something we've talked about before, and that is that we ourselves are often the only Torah scroll that other people witness.
Right.
And it's interesting that it follows right after the passage, you shall neither add nor take away anything. And then following this is the whole discussion of don't forget. So here it's bookended between don't forget and don't add anything to it. And we have this idea of other people will see you now.
And indeed, for many of us who have lived in different parts of the country or world, oftentimes the Jewish population is such a minority that the majority population rarely gets to meet that many Jews. And so each Jew becomes sort of a living representative of Torah, of that community. And this is saying that that is a responsibility, but it is also an opportunity to gain this connection. I certainly know that from my work with many people who have chosen to convert and become Jewish, many of them, when they first come, have had something like this experience. That is to say, they will have met a Jewish person, they will have seen a Jewish community, they will have somehow encountered Jewish teachings, and they will have been struck by how clever or fair or interesting our perspective has been on the world, and different than what they have encountered elsewhere. And Craig, yes, thanks for raising your hand. Join in. Feel free to unmute. There we go.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Well, I want you to know, just to briefly introduce myself, you probably know my parents, Anthony and Jeanette.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And my testimony is that several years ago, I was impressed by a book on Jewish wisdom, and it wasn't really a complicated book. It was an easy book by an author named Wendy Mogul, called The Blessing of a Skinned Knee. But I was so impressed by the wisdom, the applicability of the things that she shared, that I've maintained a growing interest in the Jewish way, the way of Torah. So
well, thank you. I'm not familiar with that book, but I can certainly see, yes, The Wisdom of a Skinned Knee would be a good entry point to lots of helpful and insightful guidance for life.
If I might just make mention of something that this rings a bell,
mm-hmm.
in Deuteronomy chapter 4, may I mention quickly, just briefly?
Yes, of course.
It reminds me very much of Isaiah chapter 2, where I believe the language of the prophet is that many will come from around the world and speak of the wisdom of Torah.
Yes, there are many passages throughout the prophets that highlight what would eventually be our dream, that Judaism will be able to share these insights with the world, be able to help other people find not necessarily a way to become Jewish, because we don't believe that everyone has to be Jewish, but to find a path to God that is in concert with what God wants from the world. And may it happen soon for the entire world.
Thank you very much. I'll mute myself then.
That's fine. And please feel free to continue discussing and sharing or asking questions as we go. We're not a very formal group. So it goes on in this passage, if I just scroll down a little bit here, as Moses continues to share this idea with the nation. For what great nation is there that has a God so close at hand as is the Lord our God whenever we call upon him? Or what great nation has laws and rules as perfect as all this teaching that I set before you this day? But take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously, so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and to your children's children. The day that you stood before me, the Lord your God, at Horeb, remember that's another name for Mount Sinai, when the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my words, in order that they may learn to revere me as long as they live on earth, and may so teach their children. You came forward and stood at the foot of the mountain. The mountain was ablaze with flames to the very skies, dark with densest clouds. The Lord spoke to you out of the fire, heard the sound of words, but perceived no shape, nothing but a voice. Again, reminding us that Judaism believes that there is no shape or form that could ever possibly contain God. He declared to you the covenant that he commanded you to observe, the 10 commandments, and he inscribed them on 2 tablets of stone. At the same time, the Lord commanded me to impart to you laws and rules for you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. For your own sake, therefore, be most careful, since you saw no shape when the Lord your God spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire, not to act wickedly and make for yourselves a sculptured image in any likeness whatever, the form of a man or a woman, the form of any beast on earth, the form of any winged bird that flies in the sky, the form of anything that creeps on the ground, the form of any fish that is in the waters below the earth. So this is a general restatement of the prohibition on the creation of an idol that would be worshipped, made in the form of anything. But there is another exception that has to be added in to make sure that we are truly avoiding idolatry. And when you look up in the sky and behold the sun and the moon and the stars, the whole heavenly host, you must not be lured into bowing down to them or serving them. These the Lord your God allotted to other peoples everywhere under heaven. But you, the Lord took and brought out of Egypt, that iron blast furnace, to be his very own people, as is now the case. If you're following this chapter as we went through, and I know 20 verses is longer than we usually go for before we get to our commentary, you'll notice that there's a very sort of uneven plot, at least by a modern reading. God is telling us that we're going to be known by the wisdom of our statutes, by how we follow the Torah, and of course to remind us that we should be loyal to God because we have experienced that and then share it with our children. But then there is this sort of hard left turn to anti-idolatry. It's almost as though Moses was saying, and you should remember about God when God appeared, but didn't really appear because God doesn't have a body, remember. Oh, and by the way, that means no idolatry. Oh, wait, where was I? It seems very much a detour from where we were going, of the general reminder of following all the commandments. After all, idolatry is one of the 613 commandments. Why is it getting highlighted so much in this particular place and in this particular way? And that, how we link these two parts together, is going to be the thrust of our discussion and our commentary. Before we turn to the handout, does anyone have any questions up through verse 20 here? Or additional comments and reflections?
Rabbi, when I look at this passage, I see it turning at verse 9 when it's, but, my translation is, but take care so you don't forget. And then we get this whole discussion about idolatry. It kind of is reminiscent of the whole golden calf. Everything seems to flow from once you make that mistake. That's the foundational mistake, is we forget and we turn to idolatry, and it's not in its narrow sense, but in its broad sense.
Right. Moses is slipping in here a very sharp reminder that at the moment when God had manifested himself most powerfully into the spirit of all the people, it was very shortly afterwards that they began bowing down to a golden cow. So that reminder of that earlier mistake is a very powerful subtext right here. So moving on to our commentary, we're going to see how this all ties together. Right. So first, we're going to begin with this idea of us being seen as a wise and discerning nation. And we'll begin with Tur Ha'aroch. Moses points out that apart from the internal value of the laws of Torah, meaning that the internal reason we should keep them, they have an external value. If performed, the successes of a Torah-observant Jewish nation is credited to our wisdom, which in turn is credited by the nation to these laws, observance of which is perceived as the key to the success of the Jewish nation. So at once, you see the Tur Ha'aroch is both putting forward an idea of Jewish exceptionalism, but also taking away Jewish exceptionalism. He is saying that Judaism, when followed, is going to create a society that will be undeniably recognized by others as following a worthwhile path. But what he is pointing out is that it is only when that society is operating according to the laws that God gave us that will be recognized. Any discussion of innate Jewish genius or innate Jewish talent is completely off base. It is not our genetic code. It is not our generic cultural values. It is precisely the way that we engage with Torah that gives us our exceptional quality when we do it. And that is an exceptional quality, of course, that can be lost. If you find, Jewish genes, heritage in somebody, There's no reason to expect that they would be any more exceptional than any other composition of genes. It's also why when someone chooses to become Jewish, we don't have to check their genetic makeup, because by becoming Jewish, they are gaining this path to an exceptional life. Sforno goes on to continue with this idea about what our wisdom will be noticed as. Observance of the laws of the Torah is your true wisdom and will enable you to resist the lures and challenges by the heretics. So Sforno is beginning to understand how this transition works, of why God talks about our wisdom and then talks about idolatry. And he's saying it is the wisdom that prevents idolatry. And of course, falling to idolatry then, in the obverse, would be considered the height of foolishness, as Moses tries to highlight by pointing out that we have every reason to believe in God and no reason to believe in idols. To reverse that, to disbelieve God and believe in idols, would be the exact opposite of intelligence. And even those other nations that maybe worship idols would recognize that, given the experience the Jewish people had had, for us to forsake our connection to such a close and personal God would be absolutely dumb. So why does it happen? Because we know throughout the entire First Temple period, the destruction of which we are commemorating tonight and tomorrow with the holiday of Tisha B'Av, why was idolatry one of the most prevalent transgressions of the entire nation? And as I've mentioned many times, the archaeological evidence, of course, backs this up. We find archaeological evidence throughout that time period for rampant idolatry, both great and small, across the entire territory of Israel. If it was so obviously stupid, why was it so common? Well, that is going to come into play when we try to understand how God then tells us to avoid the traps. As we saw, where God said specifically, do not look at the sun, the moon, and the stars and worship them. He used the line, because those have been assigned to the other nations. Now, on the one hand, if you're reading that in a very superficial way, you might think, well, so they've got those idols to worship, for worshiping a natural item is making it into an idol, but we don't. But that would imply that there is still some potency. If other nations are connected to the gods or divineness of other forms, then that would indeed make it very hard for us to resist. You know, if there's something there, then maybe we should join in. So instead, Rashi is going to try and give us from the Talmud a couple different ways to understand this. So the first example that he tries to give us is, what does it mean when it says that the sun, the moon, and the rest have been assigned to the other nations? That means to give light to them, right? They've been given an assigned job. And the assigned job is to give light, not to be powerful deities, because they're not to have any spiritual significance, because they don't, but they give light. That is their assigned role in the world. If you're thinking there might be a bit of a challenge with that topic, just hold on. We're going to get to another layer of understanding in a second. But Rashi himself seems to feel that that is an insufficient explanation of our verse. And so he adds another explanation, that which God assigns to them as deities, which seems a little shocking, right? God assigns these other celestial beings, not beings, but objects, to be treated as deities by other nations. But what he means by this, or rather what the Talmud meant by this, he did not prevent them from going astray after them, but he allowed them to err through vain speculations in order to drive them out from the world. Similarly, as it states, this time in Psalms 36, he, meaning God in context, made him, meaning human, err through his eyes until his iniquity be found and he be hated. The idea being that God allowed these things to be traps to other people to see whether they would worship them, and in so doing, distance themselves from the true God. Now, if that seems a little awkward, both on the one hand that light is being given just to these other people, because don't we also have light? And also the fact that it seems like God is almost entrapping people. Siftei Chachamim, our next commentary, which is a supra commentary, meaning it is a commentary on Rashi's commentary, tries to explain what Rashi meant by bringing these two texts in context. The first explanation, as we said, is problematic, for why does it say to them, meaning giving light just to the other nations? Do the stars shine only for them? Therefore, Rashi says another explanation. So Siftei Chachamim is saying, Rashi recognized that this was an incomplete justification of the term. Therefore, there had to be something that complemented it to fill in the rest of the idea. Yet the second explanation is problematic, for why did God create something in the first place that will cause people to err, right? Why make a stumbling block? Are we not told in the book of Leviticus not to put a stumbling block before the blind? And yet here it seems that God has created something that might cause that. After all, is it not written, again from Psalms 89 now, the world was built with kindness, right? God did not design the world to be mean. God designed the world with kindness. So if there was something that seems to be creating a trap for people, that seems kind of the opposite of kind. Therefore, both reasons are necessary. All right, so that last line is still a little cryptic, but let me try to explain what Siftei Chachamim is doing here. This is a common thing that this particular commentary tries to do, which is to say, when Rashi brings two explanations, it's not because he couldn't decide, it's because the full answer is only understood when both of them are together. So in this particular case, what Rashi is trying to say, according to Siftei Chachamim, is that God gave the nations of the world light that they could use, and he gave them the opportunity of their own free will to choose to worship that light if they choose. He did not make it just to tempt them. If they want to avoid the temptation, they still get the benefit of all of the light of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and of the calendar benefit of understanding the constellations and all of that. That's all there, right? And God has gifted that to them regardless of what they will do with it. But he has also gifted to them free will. And it wasn't that God it wasn't that God wanted to make the mistake, but God needed to give the world light. God needed to give the world a calendar they could see in the sky, even though he knew that by giving that to them, there would be the chance of them misusing it, of misunderstanding these things and treating them as though they were deities themselves. So God has allotted them the sky, and what they do with it is ultimately up to them. They can benefit from it as light, and they can stumble through it by treating it as gods. Questions or comments on that explanation of this allocation of the celestial bodies to them? Not seeing anybody raising hands, not seeing anything in the YouTube chat. So we will move on as we continue to understand this difficulty with the sky, the stars in the sky, and all of that, and how that was a lure for idolatry. Craig, yes, please. Oh, mute button.
Okay, can you hear me?
Gotcha.
I just heard recently, several years ago, I bought a book by Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, and he was talking about the Holocaust.
Mm-hmm.
And I have not studied this yet, but what you just read really pricked my heart with the following idea that the Holocaust, I believe his claim is, I'm oversimplifying it, but I think his claim is that it was a judgment that showed the Gentiles actually our lack of righteousness. Well, that's putting it mildly, isn't it?
But I think I understand what you mean, that it wasn't against the Jewish people. It was an opportunity for especially the people of Germany, but for others as well, to do the right thing, and they chose to do the opposite.
Yes, thank you. You said it better than I could. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
No, and it's especially as we come on, like I said, during this time of the year when we are remembering many of the great disasters of our people. We know that for the destruction of the first temple, we were given prophets and warnings and very clear instructions of what to do or not to do to prevent that destruction, which we failed to listen to and which led to the suffering of that generation. But the other catastrophes should not be immediately thought of as being our fault, but instead they are often the fault of those who have chosen to do something exceptionally wicked in their generation, and making sure that we can distinguish between that which was warned and cautioned so that we could avoid it, and therefore the punishment is understandable, and that which we were merely the victims of because someone else was choosing poorly, is a very important distinction to make at this time of year especially. So Chizkuni, like I said, is going to continue with this idea of what is it about...
Rabbi,
Natan, yes.
Sorry for what you say. So if someone else choose incorrectly, okay, or choose a path of wickedness, why Jewish people or innocent people need to pay for the mistake of other people, especially if they are not part of the Jewish people?
So I mean, this is a very long question, but one that is really at the heart of how we look at the world through a lens of kindness and compassion, because we don't want people to suffer because of someone else's decision. Mm-hmm. But if I drop a rock off a building and it doesn't fall, because if it fell, it would hurt someone, then actually my free will has been removed, because now I never know whether my actions will lead to a consequence. Mm-hmm. The only way free will works in a responsible universe where we are held responsible for our actions is if our actions will inevitably and absolutely and unavoidably have the consequence that is attached to them. If I pull a trigger on a gun, and sometimes a bullet comes out and sometimes it doesn't, because if I'm pointing it at someone God doesn't like, it will shoot them. And if I'm pointing it at someone God does like, it won't shoot them. Then I'm not shooting anyone. Now my gun isn't the issue. I'm not the issue. It's simply God doing whatever God wants. And that removes my own free will of whether or not I wanted to pull the trigger, of whether or not I should be held accountable for pulling the trigger. And so in order for there to be a measure of justice in the world, our actions have to work. They have to lead to their inevitable consequence. Does that mean that God has not performed miracles to try and spare as many as possible? Of course. But when somebody makes a concerted effort to do evil, they will be able to do their evil in order that they will have the free will to choose, because otherwise choosing to do good would be equally meaningless. If I could not choose to harm a person, then I'm not choosing to help a person. And that means that the free will that God has given us as the greatest gift to all of humanity wouldn't be a gift at all. It would be just an illusion. And there would be no righteousness in God's judgment for those who do right and those who do wrong.
I understand. I understand your explanation. I appreciate. My problem is with accountability. From a theological point of view, okay, I can make the Jewish people accountable, especially for tomorrow, Tisha B'Av, if that you pay a price as a consequence of acts that you did incorrectly, that you didn't choose the correct decision when you had the free will, and so now you pay the consequence. That's okay. However, it's something completely different to make someone pay and make accountable for something that they don't have any influence in the process, in the decision process. For example, the first temple, our fault. Second temple, also our fault. Okay.
According to the rabbis, yes.
Yes. But the other event in Tisha B'Av, the expulsions, we didn't have any opportunity in the input at all. The opposite, we try to avoid. So I think I have a problem from a theological point of view that we are accountable for something that someone else, not from our people, maybe they did a very weakened act, or they had another way to think, and there's
Right.
consequences, but we are paying that we are not connected, and we don't have any possibility during the process to try to prevent or to improve the decision.
Right. I think the distinction is I wouldn't use the term accountable. I would use the term suffering. Right. So we're not accountable for the actions of others. We're not paying the price in the sense that they have sinned and we're the ones who are paying the price for their sin. They will pay their own price. And indeed, you know, with the Holocaust, we certainly know that Nazi Germany paid a huge price for all of their anger and aggression and hate. Their country was mostly destroyed by the end of World War II. We don't pay the price for their sin, but we do suffer because of their sin. And that is simply because their actions need to be able to have consequences. The same way that, you know, a victim of spousal abuse, if one spouse strikes the other, the one who strikes needs to pay the price. They need to be held accountable. They need justice to be done, and they need to be punished for that. The one who has been hurt is suffering because of it. But that doesn't mean that they're the only one who is going to pay that price. So we need to sort of separate these two terms, one from the other. Why do we also suffer because of their actions? Because their actions are real. Their actions have consequence. And whoever is the target of their actions, whether it be us, other nations, or individuals, they are going to suffer when other people choose. That is ultimately the lesson all the way from the beginning of the Torah through till the end of the Tanakh, is that human beings choose and human beings live and die by the consequences. That we have been given free will from the garden, and how we choose to follow God's ways and hopefully be wise in the teachings at the beginning of chapter 4 will mark us for good. And if we choose not to, then we and the victims of our choices will each suffer independently. But in order for our choices to be choices, they need to have an impact. Much like if you, as a teacher, if a student fails a test, you know, why should they have to actually pay the price, right? Why, if they didn't study and they got an F, why give them the F, right? Why does that have to happen? Right? I mean, really, is it helping anything? They need to be shown that their choices actually had a result. And for them, that result was very negative. We become very compassionate when their result moves beyond them and it hurts other people. But unfortunately, and fortunately, that is simply the natural law of the universe, right? When I drop that stone, when I pull that trigger, when I act in a certain way, my actions will affect more than just me in my own little bubble. And that's why our actions have to be weighed so carefully so that we avoid hurting other people, ourselves as well, but additionally hurting others. If you're not 100% satisfied with this answer, good, right? Because we should always be upset and frustrated by any additional suffering that happens into the world that other people have caused, or that we ourselves have caused. That is absolutely the right emotional response. But with regards to the overall structure of the universe, there was simply no other way God could have created the world to have allowed both free will and justice and a chance to make the world in the direction it should be. Chizkuni, though. We need to get some chizkuni on the table. The luminaries shine for all of mankind, regardless of their religious orientation. They shine equally for the dumb and the intelligent, the righteous or the evildoers. Anyone who worships such phenomenon, which do not distinguish between different categories of creatures, must surely consider himself as having been greatly humiliated by such gods. Right? Imagine if you were a sun worshiper and you were having an argument with a moon worshiper. Well, the sun worshiper would say, the sun shines down on me, but not you. No, of course it shines down on the moon guy too. And the moon gives light for the sun worshiper. Apparently, all of these things that people treat as gods don't seem to care which religion you belong to, which is the ultimate proof that they're not gods. Right? If the sun were truly a god, the sun would only send its rays to those who worshipped it. If the moon were truly a god, the moon would only shine on those who worshipped it. The fact that the sun and the moon are completely indifferent to the difference to humans as well as animals shows that these are not gods. A different interpretation about the words which he has assigned to all nations: the phenomena in the sky are indeed intended to exert a degree of awe for all other nations, barring the Jewish people. You, the Jewish people, whom God has chosen as his inheritance on earth, it behooves not to bow down to any power but to him. They need not be in awe of any other phenomena in nature. And again, this is something we've taught in our religious school a number of times, but I'm always surprised by how many adults have never recognized the incredible majesty of the night sky, which is absolutely stunning, or the incredible beauty of the sun as it either rises, sets, or gives life to everything around us. It is staggering, and it should be staggering. And it's natural that people would find that awe-inspiring. But for Judaism, we have to be especially alert to not ascribe the awe we feel to the objects we are witnessing, because we understand that the awe we feel ultimately belongs to God, that is the ultimate source, because we have been given the gift of revelation and the experience of our history to recognize that more clearly. And just to make that clearer, Rabbeinu Bacha brings this interesting little grammatical insight. He says there is a difference between the word hashamayim and the word hashamaima. Now, just as there is a difference between the word Mitzrayim and Mitzrayma. Now, this ending at many words in the biblical Hebrew is a directional suffix, meaning if I say Mitzrayma, I'm really saying towards Egypt. And if I say Hashmaima, I would say towards the heavens. But he's going to interpret it a little bit differently than that surface level grammatical structure. As he argues, when the Torah describes Hashamayim, the heaven, this includes any part of the sky visible to the eye anywhere. All parts of the sky are the same for that purpose. However, when the Torah speaks of Hashamaima, meaning heavenwards towards, he's saying it's not, you can't be towards the whole thing. You have to be towards a part of thing. All right, if I'm saying I'm going to Orlando, there's something in Orlando that is my compass point. And he's arguing that when we say to the sky, that there's some specific point that I am referring to. It refers to the specific areas of the sky, areas known for certain constellations of stars, etc. They are areas where certain patterns of stars, what we would call constellations, always appear at intervals that are subject to human calculations. Seeing that certain such constellations appear to presage certain happenings at certain times, some people err in ascribing powers to these constellations. This is why the Torah warns the Jewish people not to raise their eyes to such parts of the sky and the constellations visible there. Now, he's not necessarily talking about, horoscopes and astrology. What he is talking about is the much more important and ancient scientific practice of noticing that when certain constellations were in certain places in the sky, especially at certain times of year, that would be when it was a good time to plant your seeds, when the floods were going to be coming, when it was about time to harvest, and when other seasonal and annual changes would happen. So it wasn't surprising, he argues, that people would notice this pattern and they would mistake the hands on the clock in the sky for being the actual hand moving the events one to the other, as though when one constellation came up, it was the one that made the rivers flood. It's simply the hand on the clock, but to a person who didn't realize that, they might accidentally think that the hand in the sky, the constellation, was the one causing the effect on the earth. And we need to be very careful, again, that we avoid falling down that trap. Everyone understand his constellation explanation? Okay. So we're going to continue now with Sefer HaChinuch, again, the great compilation of, come on, why did my thing want to put that bar up? Okay, you know what? The internet, what are you going to do? The great compilation of understanding the different mitzvot one by one. So he goes, in this case, in Leviticus, but we'll bring in our text as well. To turn not after the worshiping of idols. This is one of the commandments. Number 213, if you're keeping count. Not in thought, not in speech, and not in vision. To not turn after idolatry with thought or speech, and not even only with sight, so that he not come from this to serve it. As it is stated, Leviticus 19, you shall not turn to the idols. And they, may their memory be blessed, this is the sages of our ancestry, said in Sifra, Hiroshim 111, if you turn after them, you make them gods. Meaning to say, if you involve yourself with their matters, meaning to ponder after the follies of those that believe in them, say about it that constellation X or star Y does this action, or incense X or service Y, you constantly observe the forms that their worshipers make in order to know the manner of its worship, all of this can seduce you after it. What he is bringing to our attention is that simply by turning towards these questions and seeking the information that these others have, we have already made a step in the wrong direction. Just understanding it, just thinking about it in this way, is already putting a seed in our mind that leads us towards the inevitability of idolatry. All this negative commandment, meaning the prohibition of thought about idolatry, is repeated in another place. As it is stated, Deuteronomy 11 this time, guard yourself, lest your hearts be seduced and you serve. A reminder that in the biblical idiom, heart doesn't just mean a seat of emotion, it means the seat of the whole personality, both emotion as well as logical and rational thought. Meaning to say that if your heart spends much time in thinking about it, it will be a cause to divert you from the straight path and to be involved in its surface. And it is also stated about this matter, this time from our verse, Deuteronomy 4:19, and lest you lift your eyes to the heavens and see. As this verse is not that a man not lift up his eyes to the sky and observe the heavens, right? We are allowed to look at the sky, but the intention of the thing is that he not observe them with his heart's eye, to know their power and their makeup in order to serve them. Matan, do you have your hand up there?
Yes, sorry, Rabbi. I was thinking what you read about this Sefer HaChinuch. So if we follow up what they wrote, or he wrote actually, means everyone today apply paganism because we follow the zodiac signs. And we see for each zodiac sign what are the actions that we're supposed to do, depend on what will happen, depending the stars and everything. So that's not a part of paganism?
No, it is. I absolutely do not think astrology is something that Jews should be involved in. To astronomy, sure. Measure the stars, measure the galaxies, measure gravity, all of that, wonderful. Astrology, actually thinking that the constellations have any power or influence over the world, that is absolutely the seed of idolatry. John, you have your hand up too?
Yes, I know in the Siddur there's that one margin note, what is an idol? And it's and I can't find it, but it's anything that we look to other than God, a thing of wealth, a political philosophy that takes us away from Torah. Anything that takes us away from Torah is an idol.
Exactly, and in particular, I believe the passage you're referring to is right after the Shema Ve'ahavta, as it's trying to remind us to stay away from idolatry, and it says that anything that we put above God is by definition an idol. And with that in mind, we're also going to see in the next paragraph from Rambam that also things we put beneath God, between us and God, also are considered idols. But first, let's finish Sefer HaChinuch, his teaching. And scripture prohibited this explicitly, as it is written this time in Numbers 15, and you shall not stray after your hearts. Remember, that doesn't just mean emotion. Even your own logical ideas can lead you the wrong place. and may their memories be blessed, said, this time in the Talmud, that for Israel, the Holy One, blessed be he, does not consider a thought of sin to be like an act, except for the thought of idolatry, which is considered for a person to be like the act. This is unique out of all of the other commandments of the Torah, out of all of Judaism. The only thought that we are held accountable for is if a person seriously considers and contemplates idolatry. Discussing idolatry like this, where we are saying it's not true, no problem. But if you actually say, maybe, and you really do for a moment believe that, that is something you need to repent for. That is something you need to do tshuva for. Because the only way the seed of idolatry can truly enter into your mind is if you have pushed God out for that moment. Because the two simply cannot coexist in your mind at the same time. And so the thought of idolatry is a rejection of God. Again, that doesn't mean we're not allowed to discuss it, talk about it, and point out its errors. It means for a person to even for a short while seriously consider it as being valid. That is when there's a problem. All right, and then like I promised, in Rambam, we're going to talk about not just things that we might think of are above God, but also things that are below God could be a problem. The primary warning concerning worship of stars, which is the general euphemism in Jewish literature for any form of idolatry, is not to revere any among all creatures, no angel, no planet, no star, none of the four elements, nor any of their offspring, though the worshiper be conscious that Adonai is God, and he be worshiping a given being as the inception of the worship of Enoch and the people of his generation. Behold, he worships idolatry. All right. Rambam is much easier in the Hebrew than he is in the English. So what he is trying to say here is that even if you accept that Adonai, the actual God, is God, but you worship something that was created by God, whether it be the form of an animal, an angel, an element, or anything like that, that is one of the ways that idolatry takes root. And this was considered, according to Jewish tradition, to be the folly that came from the generation of Enoch. It is respecting this very subject that the warning in the Torah was given in Deuteronomy 4:19. That is to say, lest you spread out in your mind's vision, beholding that these are guiding the universe, meaning the stars or the sun, the moon, and that God portioned them out to all the world to live in perpetuity and not fade as the course of the universe is, and then say that to such it is right to bow down and to worship. Right? Even on this subject, he commanded and said, take heed of yourselves, lest your heart be deceived. That is to say, do not fall in error by the thought of your heart to worship these, to make of them a mediator between yourselves and the Creator. So what he's saying is that it's natural. If you were to recognize the glory of the stars and see in them as being this amazing wheel of a calendar that is giving us the ability to predict what will come next in the seasons of the world, you might think, you know what, it's befitting to worship this as well. The same way that if you were to visit the king, you would also pay respect to the assistants of the king and to the princes and to the other people that have some of the king's reflected glory. You would give them some extra respect from what you would give to regular people. That's normal and natural for humans. But when it comes to God, sharing any of the awe that we give to God with any of God's creations, even if we think that it is meant to be ultimately in praise of God, is already leading us down that slippery slope of idolatry. Make sense? Okay, so let's try and bring it back to the wisdom of all of this that is giving us our ultimate stake in the world. According to the principal meaning of the text, the meaning is that these celestial bodies were put at the disposal of all nations to serve them. By doing so, God wanted to show that he is not concerned about their competition as influences that could override his authority in the universe. Right? Rashbam gives a slightly different twist, and he says, look, the fact that God allows people to make the mistake and worship them shows that he doesn't consider them to be meaningful competition, right? You only get rid of that which you actually fear as competition. If God had thought that there was a real danger of these other things being a challenge to him, he wouldn't have made them, or wouldn't have even allowed it to have ever become physically possible for a person to be seduced by them. But God looks and says, look, stars are stars, right? Giant balls of self-combusting gas. Why do I need to worry whether someone decides to worship them? That does not take away from me. And it's with that in mind that we can see the true wisdom that God was trying to have us display to the rest of the world, right? This is from Rabbeinu Bachya. All these statutes, the particular word that's used is chukim, which in Hebrew usually means the different commandments that God gave us that were not always self-evident. Things like not mixing wool and linen in our clothing. Things that don't seem to have an easily identifiable, rational purpose. We would have expected Moses to say all these commandments, mitzvot, but he didn't. The fact is that not only do the Gentile nations not praise the Jewish people for these statutes they observe, but they make fun of us for performing laws, the value of which they do not comprehend, right? People will say, you really care what your suit is made out of, whether it's made from wool and linen, and you don't even know why, because your famous book didn't tell you why, your God didn't make this clear. You really think that in the ancient world, using the ashes of a red cow had some difference than the ashes of any other cow, and you can't even tell me why? Yeah, you stupid people. All right, we've been made fun of more for our hukim than for our statutes than when we say don't murder. Most people agree when we say don't murder is a good rule, or if we say don't steal. But the things that are uniquely difficult to understand, that is where we often get mocked. However, when the nations observe that by performing the commandments which do make sense to us, the Jewish people have achieved a position of great prominence and success in the world, they reason that there must also be hidden values to the statutes, even though such meanings defy our logic. They realize that the Torah does not contain any meaningless laws. There are so many people, and for most of human history, who think that having a statue, having a picture, saying a few prayers to some of these other spirits, gods, idols, whatever you want to call it, or however they try to dress it up, what harm is there, right? I mean, really, if there's nothing bad about it, am I really hurting myself? Am I hurting the world? Does God really care? You know, that kind of eclectic worship has been the standard for most of human history. And even to this day, many religions have borrowed symbology and faith practices from other nations that have the seeds of idolatry in it. And when you try to explain, from the Jewish point of view, how dangerous this is, how problematic this is, we sound crazy, right? We sound silly. I mean, you're telling me that putting a little golden statue of Zeus in my corner, and when there's a hurricane coming or a storm, saying, a little prayer to Zeus, that somehow this is bad, somehow this is dangerous. I mean, how in the world could this hurt the world? And yet Judaism knows that a world without that framework of idolatry, that a community that is willing to see that the creator of all is there for each person directly, without the need of an intermediary, and without sharing any of God's glory and power with the rest of some heavenly pantheon, that actually allows for a more moral, just, compassionate, kind, successful community, that even if they don't believe our explanations, they can't argue with the results. And they recognize that, you know what? Idolatry might have some problems with it. And one of the things that our different sages have said over the centuries is that in many ways, this has been one of the most profound impacts that Judaism has had on the world. That slowly, both through ourselves and more through our sister faiths of Christianity and Islam, as well as through many secular authorities as well, we have pushed idolatry back into the shadows in many, many parts of the world. Idolatry now is much less common than it ever was in the past. And lo and behold, if you look around at the world, I know 2020 doesn't always feel it, but we are better than we were in the past. If you were to chart, the percentage of the world worshiping idols and the number of people killed by violence, the number of people who suffer under exploitation or who are harmed by others, well, they actually correlate pretty closely. The less idolatry in the world, the better the world has been by most measures. And I can't claim that I have a perfect logical explanation for that, although I think it's pretty compelling from what we've read today, as well as the rest of Torah and history. But you can't argue with results. And with that, I'll open it up for additional comments or questions. And I'm interested to see what people have to say. Everybody is stunned silent, or you all forgot to unmute. Which is fine. Sometimes it takes a while for things to percolate and sink in. But as we stand here in the shadow of Tisha B'Av and commemoration of many of the catastrophes and destruction, it is something to remember that through all of the problems that our people have had, we also have had incredible successes, and this is one of them. We have changed the world away from idolatry in a way that I think is one of the most meaningful gifts we've ever given. Natan?
Yes, I was thinking about something that I listened in Tanakh studies about the same aliyah. I think it's the second aliyah, if I remember correctly. And that the explanation was similar that you gave, but the alternative, meaning that maybe when God expected from us, or Moshe actually expected of us, is that try to find a different way to connect with God. That maybe that I know that the Jewish people really are trying all the time to connect with God, but they don't not always find the correct path. That's why, for example, when Moshe climbed to Mount Sinai, and the people immediately ran to ask for Aaron to create an Egel Azav.
The golden calf, right?
Yeah, the golden calf. Thank you. Because they thought that he will not come back, and they need some way to connect with God. So maybe Moshe knows that people really, the Jewish people want to be close to God. That's why, by the way, they created the tabernacle after that. And so they try to say to them, you know what, maybe intuitively you will try to pray and to create symbols of stars, of animals, because those are things that were created by God, and in this way, indirectly, you think that you will be closer to God. But right. Maybe someone to say to us, you know what, try to find a better way, better path to talk and to connect and to have a better relationship with God, more direct.
Right, exactly. I wouldn't call that opposite. That's very, I think, complementary. It works together with what we've been discussing. You know, one of the things that I think is so powerful is that there is a human drive to connect to God. Right? There is an innate homing instinct of wanting to draw close to God. It's just most people left on their own end up going down dead ends or dangerous paths trying to find that connection. And like you said, we see that in the story of the Jewish people right after we leave Egypt, and we see it throughout our history for hundreds and hundreds of years of people continually trying to add new points of connection, but doing it in very messy and often very negative ways. But that does speak to that spirit in people that is trying to reconnect with God in this world, and just not always knowing how to do it. Anything else from anyone, or we'll wrap it up for today? All right. As always, thank you all for joining together and sharing a little lunchtime study. I hope people will be able to join us for our service tonight at 8:30. And a reminder for those who are coming to the Mishnah class that yes, we do have Mishnah tonight from 7 till 8. One of the advantages of doing everything online is we don't have to worry about driving from one part of the town to the other. Take care, everyone, and be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.